Welcome to the AI-powered reader, your shortcut to unlocking the world's best books. Get ready to absorb key insights, understand core concepts, and expand your knowledge all in a fraction of the time. Let's dive in.
Today we're delving into Malcolm Gladwell's latest work, Revenge of the Tipping Point. This book is not a sequel, but a forensic investigation into the underside of social epidemics. Gladwell warns that the very same tools we use to build a better world can also be used against us. As he writes, if the world can be moved by just the slightest push, then the person who knows where and when to push has real power. This book is his forensic investigation into that power. Gladwell poses a critical set of questions for our time. Who are those people who can tip the world? What are their intentions? What techniques are they using? Guiding us is Malcolm Gladwell, the author of 7 New York Times bestsellers, including The Tipping Point and Outliers. As co-founder of Pushkin Industries and host of the podcast Revisionist History, he has built a career on reconsidering things both overlooked and misunderstood. Now, in a fascinating turn, he applies that same forensic lens to his own iconic work, asking what he missed the first time around. Let's begin.
Okay, so think back about 25 years. Malcolm Gladwell drops a book that completely changes how we talk about ideas, The Tipping Point, right? It became this huge cultural touchstone, a really hopeful book that just perfectly matched a hopeful time. But a quarter century is a long time. And today, we're diving into Gladwell's big return to his most famous idea, a book where he kind of argues with his younger self and has to grapple with a much, much darker world. So here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll get into why Gladwell even called this a revenge. Then we'll unpack the book's really cool structure. It's all about puzzles and these things he calls overstories. After that, we'll hit the 3 big core ideas you need to know. And finally, we'll wrap up by looking at Gladwell's genius, for sure, but also some of his potential blind spots. All right, let's start with that title. Why a revenge? I mean, that's a pretty strong word, right? But it really gets to the heart of why he wrote this. The original book was all about, hey, here's how we can start positive epidemics of change. This new book is about how that exact same knowledge can be flipped and used against us. To really get the new book, you gotta transport yourself back to the year 2000. The Y2K bug didn't end the world, crime rates were plummeting, the Cold War was a memory. There's just this genuine sense of optimism in the air, and The Tipping Point just captured that mood perfectly. It was basically a recipe for making good things happen, showing how small changes could have these massive positive effects. But fast forward 25 years and you've got Gladwell looking back at that original work and, constantly asking himself, how could I have possibly left that out? He felt like that original recipe was just incomplete. There were these huge gaping holes in the argument that he just couldn't ignore anymore, especially in the world we live in today, which is, let's face it, way more complicated. And that's the revenge part. The core and kind of chilling idea of this new book is that the rules of social epidemics are totally neutral. They don't care if you're good or bad. So yeah, you can use them to lower crime rates, but they can also be exploited, sometimes on purpose, sometimes by accident, to spread things like addiction, fraud, and, of course, misinformation. So how does he build this new, darker argument? Well, the book is structured like a fantastic detective story. He presents us with a series of mysteries or puzzles and then gives us the conceptual tools, like overstories, that we need to solve them. It basically unfolds in these 3 stages. He kicks things off with the puzzles, these things that just don't seem to make any sense. From there, he introduces us to the social engineers who can shape these epidemics. And finally, he reveals the overstory, these powerful, invisible stories that are running in the background of our lives. So let's start with those puzzles. Okay, puzzle number 1. Back in the 80s and 90s, Los Angeles was hit by this totally unprecedented crime wave. I'm talking about an explosion of bank robberies. It got so bad the FBI had to give the robbers nicknames just to tell them apart. You had the Mummy Bandit, the Michael Jackson Bandit, even the Village People. It was like the whole city had just lost its mind. So what was going on? Puzzle number 2 is a medical mystery. In the 1970s, a researcher named John Wenberg found something absolutely bizarre in Vermont. He discovered that your odds of getting a super common surgery, like having your tonsils out or your appendix removed, had almost nothing to do with how sick you were. It all depended on what town you lived in. I mean, how is that even possible? Your health depends on your zip code? And the third puzzle is deeply personal. It's the story of a man named Philip Esformis. In Chicago, he was a successful, respected guy from a good family, but then he moves to Miami and gets tangled up in one of the biggest Medicare fraud schemes in U.S. history. A rabbi who knew him put it perfectly. He said he started as Philip of Chicago and became Philip of Miami, a ruined individual. The question is, how does that happen? What changed? Okay, so with those three head-scratchers on the table, Gladwell starts to unpack these three really powerful ideas that don't just solve the puzzles, they give us a whole new way of looking at the world. The first big idea is actually a callback to the original book, but he gives it a darker twist. It's the law of the few. The basic idea is that social epidemics, good or bad, they aren't driven by everybody, not even close. They're propelled by a tiny, tiny group of exceptional people he calls super spreaders. So, remember that insane bank robbery explosion in LA? Turns out it wasn't some citywide crime wave at all. It was largely the work of just two guys, Robert Casper Brown and Donzel C. Dog Thompson. These two masterminded 175 robberies. They were the super spreaders. You take them off the board and the quote-unquote epidemic pretty much disappears. You see the exact same principle with the opioid crisis. I mean, look at these numbers for OxyContin. Over 60% of doctors wrote on average less than one prescription. But then you look at the top, just 1.5% of physicians were writing hundreds of prescriptions each. The entire epidemic was being fueled by this handful of super spreader doctors. Okay, the second big idea is called overstory. This one's really cool. Gladwell compares it to the upper canopy of a forest. You know, the top layer of leaves that determines how much sun gets to the plants on the ground. An overstory is an invisible, community-level story, a set of unspoken rules and beliefs that powerfully shapes how everyone living inside it behaves. And this brings us right back to Philip Esformis. See, he didn't just pack his bags and move to a new city. He moved into a totally different overstory. In places like LA or Minneapolis, Medicare was spending maybe a couple $100 per person on certain equipment. But in Miami, it was over $1,200. He walked into a culture, an overstory, of fraud so blatant and widespread that his own massive criminal schemes seemed almost normal. The third idea is something Gladwell calls the magic third. It's his fascinating idea about critical mass. Basically, when a new group hits a certain number inside a bigger group, somewhere between 25 and 33%, something incredible happens. They stop being just tokens and they start to fundamentally change the culture of the entire group. The research on this is just brilliant. You see, if you have one or two women on a corporate board, they often get treated like tokens. Their voices can be ignored, the pressure is immense. But add a third woman and you hit that magic third. Suddenly, they can form alliances. The whole dynamic becomes more collaborative. Their voices are actually heard. 2 isn't enough to change the culture, but 3 is a tipping point. All right, so we've got the big ideas down. Now let's do something important, which is to look at both the absolute genius of Gladwell's approach and maybe a few of its blind spots. Because nothing's perfect, right? First off, let's just state the obvious. The guy is an absolute master storyteller. I mean, he can take this dense, kind of dry academic research, like that work on small area variation in medicine, and turn it into a story you just can't put down. And he has this wild ability to connect things you would never think are related, like cheetah genetics and youth suicide clusters. It just makes the ideas stick in your brain. But, and this is a big but, that incredible storytelling skill leads directly to one of the biggest critiques of his work. Are these stories maybe a little too neat? You hear the term just so stories a lot. You know, does creating that perfect, compelling narrative mean you have to smooth over the messy, complicated parts of reality? Does it oversimplify problems that are, in truth, just incredibly complex? And this kind of points to a potential blind spot, a hyper-focus on individuals instead of systems. I mean, think about it. Is it really enough to blame superspreader doctors for the opioid crisis without talking about the corporate greed and regulatory failures that lit the fuse? Can you really get the Miami fraud overstory without looking at the bigger economic policies that allowed that culture to fester? And yet, even with those very fair critiques, you can't deny the power of what he does. This is the other huge strength of his work. He gives us a new language, powerful words like overstory and magic third that literally help us see the hidden patterns all around us. He makes you question your default assumptions and really appreciate the profound, invisible power that our contexts in our community have over us. And really, this all leads to Gladwell's final and maybe most provocative point. He's basically saying, look, the tools to understand and maybe even control these social epidemics, they're just sitting there, right on the table in front of us. We can identify the superspreaders. We can understand the overstories. We can engineer tipping points. So the question he leaves us with is a really big one. Now that we know how this stuff works, who gets to use these tools? And to what end?
That's all for this episode of the AI-Powered Reader. We hope today's summary sparked new ideas and brought you valuable insights. If you enjoyed what you heard, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and consider leaving a review. It really helps others discover the show. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep reading, or rather listening.